sex, lies, and bigotry. Yeah. Several years ago, I was invited by Ruth and Siga to submit a paper on the methodology and the history of philosophy, focusing on these questions. I couldn't go to the conference, but this is the paper that it inspired. What we must now do is look at the above questions and ask how much has changed over the centuries. How much has changed over the centuries, and how much confidence can we have in the presently accepted canon of philosophy? Talking about degree of change, some people who teach and write histories of philosophy may be confident that I'm sure all of you think you know the history of philosophy. I certainly thought that I kind of knew it. And you know the major contributors from Pythagoras to Poincaré, etc. And you also, I'm sure, are familiar with these important members of our philosophical canon. John of Teignmouth. I imagine the dentures made out of tin, I don't know. Henry of Brabant. Now these are people who are in the margins of the accepted current history of philosophy. Our historical canon is drawn from what I call a compendium, and this might be, I don't know, a ridiculous kind of claim to make, but that the historical canon is drawn from what I call the compendium. That is all works of philosophy, whether or not they're presently known. Okay, so we don't know what's in the compendium. We know a lot of what is, but we don't know it all. The compendium includes a historical canon. Okay, it's in there and marginalized in the historical canon. But included are a few women and a few non-whites and a few non-Westerners. Of course, now we're talking exclusively about the Western canon, and there's no possible moral justification, as Waithe just pointed out, I think very forcefully. There's no way of thinking about ourselves as Western philosophy or Eastern philosophy. There's philosophy, right? Okay, yes. And we all are a little bit different. So, this compendium includes a historical canon and works that are lost but whose titles are remembered in history books and so on. But by definition then, historians of philosophy cannot know the entire historical canon because we haven't found it all yet. But they're well versed in a subsection of it that is what we call our historical canon. That is what is accepted as the canon of philosophy now. Significant works, insights, arguments, authors' names, schools, movements, things like that all get put into our basic reference works in philosophy, the big encyclopedias and so on and so forth. So there were minor players always in this canon, and they're not always known. Under normal circumstances, the informal historical canon evolves kind of gradually from this larger compendium in an almost organic way through an informal process rather than by a formal methodology. Okay, recent works by philosophy generate interest, people write about it, we exchange views on it in symposia such as this, and that's how this canon gradually comes together. But there's no formal procedure for it. There's no number of votes that you need to get into the canon. There's no minimum number of publications or anything like that. It's very haphazard. If a work from the compendium is pre-selected for omission from our canon on spurious grounds, such as the race or gender of its author, it's as silly as one of my daughter's books from way back, right? It's a childish thing to say no girls allowed, I think, or no non-whites. And if a work is selected to be omitted from the canon on the grounds of race or gender of its author, it's as though only let's say only Ruth Hagengruber used inorganic pesticides in her yard. Well, what's the effect on Paderborn? A negative effect, but a very slight effect, right? Because everybody else might be using organic pesticides. But if the relatively organic process of growing our historical canon were abandoned and spurious pre-selection was to be used for many centuries in succession, then, like any natural system in which all of Paderborn use inorganic pesticides, the effect on the environment that is the discipline of philosophy will be toxic, and indeed it now is. Under such circumstances, the historical canon cannot be considered to be the true canon of philosophy. Historians of philosophy, those of us who think we know the historical canon, have at best an incomplete, confused, vague notion, and I'm saying this about myself because people sometimes call me an expert in this, and boy, that's far from true. We're in the same sorry but exciting circumstance that historians of religion were in when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls heralded a degree of change in the Judaic and early Christian canons. Prior to their discovery, the history was believed to have been known. It was a rich tapestry, although maybe a little tattered, a little threadbare, etc. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, no one could claim to know either the history or the canon of Judaism or early Christianity. There's another piece to a puzzle being added. We have to reconsider what the puzzle actually is. A new tapestry is being woven from the many threads of Judaism's historical canon. It's not immediately knowable whether a markedly different canon of Judaism will emerge, or whether a picture that looks more or less the same, but with just subtle details changed, would be the result. Like historians of religion, historians of philosophy now must re-examine the tapestry that is the history of philosophy and its official, unofficial canon. We do not know precisely what the history of philosophy is, but we do know that it's not what we thought it was. In the past 3 decades, we've discovered many works by many philosophers who, while they were part of the compendium, were omitted from our historical canon. So many of these women, right? More than 200, more than 1,000 works omitted from our canon that I've been able to find, and other people have found more. This new tapestry has been woven, and there's so many people who have been left out of it that it's just stupid to think that a different picture of our canon will not emerge after we take into account all these works that are now being considered. Once these loose threads are rewoven into the historical canon's tapestry, the question is, what is the degree of change? We have a question of confidence. As you know well, in the social sciences, if you have a very large database, such as our compendium, right, and the database samples nearly all of the available data, well, then we can have confidence in that. That's confidence well placed. It has high predictive value. In contrast, confidence that is based on sampling data that is pre-selected for race and gender is confidence misplaced, logic defied, and bigotry glorified. Why? Because, as is the case in philosophy, the omission of works by women and non-whites, but for now I'm just focusing on women, the omission of women from the historical canon did not follow a chain of events similar to that which led to the concealment and discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Works by women weren't, I didn't crawl around in caves in the Middle East to find this stuff. The works are in libraries. It's possible to find them. Sometimes they're not listed as women's works, but they're there. So works of philosophy by women were not hidden away. They were always part of the compendium. Why then were they viewed to have been lost or non-existent? And why do we now consider so many to have been recovered? Women philosophers' writings, part of the compendium of philosophy, have for the most part been carefully preserved in multiple copies by successive generations of scholars and librarians, and have been known to competent historians of philosophy from antiquity until the 18th century, and I don't know what happened then. But many of the works by 17th century and earlier women philosophers survive the censorship of various government and church inquisitions only due to the prevalence of humility formulas such as this, okay? After which she goes on for 300 pages of metaphysics and religious epistemology. I have nothing to say. I'm just a lewd and lowly woman. So they don't bother, what can I say? They don't bother, the authorities don't intervene with the book because they're convinced that there's nothing important to say. She just said so for the next 400 pages. Such formulas usually occurred on the first pages of women's writing. And, this is something that may have allowed some women writers to have their works preserved rather than destroyed, even though most of her book talks about the importance of Christ, our mother. From the 18th until to the 21st century, earlier source materials were still being referred to by historians of philosophy in creating their own histories and their own encyclopedias. So to write those books, they would go back and look at earlier sources. They systematically omitted mention of works by women, when in fact, out of sight, they were simply out of mind. And why were they out of sight? Because the boys didn't look for them. That's why. Those post-17th century resources are considered to identify the canonical works in our discipline, the historical canon. So we look to these encyclopedias for information as to who was a philosopher and what they did, and they repeat the same errors of omission as had happened in previous centuries. From the perspective of the discipline of history, the historical canon creates a false picture of what occurred in the past. From the perspective of the discipline of philosophy, this historical canon, like Alice through the looking glass, is distorted, confused, illogical, false, and misleading. If I can say anything else negative, I will. In a discipline in which precision, clarity, and accuracy are not only prized, but are trademark, and which those virtues are highly valued, the historical canon yields instead a vague image of reason as the domain of white males. We ought not place any confidence in the encyclopedias, the histories, the epitomes, the anthologies that are the products of that distortion. Due to the scant representation of philosophical writings by women in the present historical canon, we ought to suspend judgment as to what the true canon of our discipline is. We do not know it, and we have no justification for claiming that we do. The true canon is an ideal that we have good reason to believe we have not come close to reaching. There are additional senses in which we don't understand the history of philosophy because women have been left out. The legacy of writings by, and therefore the historical reputations of women philosophers have been harmed by the historical canon. Great philosophers, women who led ancient schools of philosophy. These weren't just philosophers, these were people who headed schools of philosophy. These women have suffered posthumous harm through the neglect of historians of philosophy. In antiquity alone, we can mention Rita of Cyrene, Epigenia of Athens, Hypatia of Alexandria. They had reputations that drew students from thousands of miles away, from Tunis to Athens. That's a long walk. I thought my travel was bad. They advanced entire movements. They had teachings and writings that were preserved by their students and their successors. This is true also for women of every later era until the early modern period. The harm done by the omission of our foremothers is, to use sports parlance, a foul. It's a foul in the sense that it violates the rule that histories ought to record the truth. It merits penalties against offenders whose reputations as historians deserve our negative criticism. But worst of all, the omission of women from the historical canon has inexorably altered the game. The historical canon has altered the profession of philosophy and every subject discipline in it. Every subject discipline in it. No one really knows the histories of these divisions of philosophy because their source materials are mostly derived from the historical canon, which has, with its inorganic pre-selection from the compendium for philosophers, race, and gender. By what method do we get from the historical canon to something that is closer to being a true canon? First, we need to understand how and why women's works were excluded in order to avoid repeating those errors. Second, we need to rediscover, reclaim, translate, discuss, evaluate all of those works, and also in the content, in their own right, and also in the content of their being commentaries on works by other philosophers, or being influenced by other philosophers, or women's works influencing male philosophers. So we have okay, I'm a little lost in my slides. So how do we get there? Why did women's writings appear in the early histories of philosophy, get excluded for at least 4 centuries, and then get reintroduced? What happened in the middle of this to cause the omission? Was it gross incompetence and ineptitude on the part of the historians, or was it their pervasive, flagrant bigotry against women? Male historians of philosophy in the past 400 years have left us a canon in which no contemporary philosopher can place any confidence. It's a portion of the compendium pre-selected for gender, and as I mentioned, for race. Contemporary source materials are derived from the previous historical canon, updated, one would hope, by recent important writings and their authors. Newer source materials and educational programs of the discipline are mostly based on that same historical canon, perpetuating the pre-selection for gender, even if entries of the most recent contributions to the discipline did not completely pre-select for it. The sheer number of women philosophers, nearly 200 and about more than 1,000 works, have been located. And in order to improve upon the historical canon, we need to understand the conditions and methodologies through which it was created and then correct those. So here are some of the, some of the forces that led to the loss of works by women. In earlier centuries, isolated copies of women's works were preserved in hand-copied recensions, memorialized in scholia, and by those who studied and reproduced their writings. But writings, not publishing. In later centuries, marked by the end of hand-copied recensions and by the beginning of mass production, the printing press, it was possible to bury our early history the way the Dead Sea Scrolls got buried, waiting for another generation to recover them. The decline of monastic and conventual scriptoria, when these started slowing down and closing down, convents closed, monasteries closed, etc., and we lost the workforce for hand copying. I mean, in the past, that was why God made students, right? You had a student who would copy down all the notes of your lecture, and that became your book 200 years later, okay? And now we've lost we've lost the free supply of women's labor. Paradoxically, it's with the invention of the printing press. It's with the development of democracies. It's with the pluralization of societies in Europe that the exclusion of women from our histories and reference works began. Why? Much like the contemporary urge to have one's own blog and website, historians and philosophers of this period wanted to be published. Most publishing was of the vanity press model. Writers raised money by having sponsors, they paid for their own publications, etc., and wealthy people could buy their books. Due to the personal responsibility for bearing the costs of printing and binding, material from the author's source work often had to be edited out for reasons of space. They simply couldn't afford to pay to print a book as big as they had written. So they cut out pieces. The querelle des femmes that had raged since Christine de Pizan again heated up as the advancement of democratic forms of government threatened men's domination in the public sphere. The misogyny of male historians of philosophy, mention of women in their works, were simply omitted. If you take, there are exceptions. What happened at the same time was the proliferation of, since Boccaccio, of famous ladies' books that tended to romanticize women. But, to say something good about Boccaccio, recorded information that was important for us who were searching. Prior to the 17th century, women were generally excluded from this. In the early modern period, women of means might publish poetry, but they couldn't publish in philosophy, theology, canon law, medicine, and often science. Various inquisitions, state censors, and other political threats certainly had a chilling effect on the publication of philosophical works by men and by women, and there were, of course, exceptions to these general limitations. But if the book was on any subject purporting to be factual, most women authors appear to have published anonymous first editions. The invention of the printing press and the various movements by civil and ecclesiastical authorities to quell unorthodox views appears to have been accompanied by the silencing of more women than men philosophers. Although fewer women than men published philosophy during this period, no women, to my knowledge, wrote comprehensive histories of philosophy at this time. It happened later. Many did mention as inspirations, earlier women philosophers, like Christine Pizan mentions earlier women philosophers, but simple mention is hardly the same as reproducing an entire text, okay? So they mention women, but the works get buried. I know of no reason.
Mary Ellen, we have 5 more minutes. Can you wrap up in 5 minutes?
I really will. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So here's the methodology that has been used, right? I call it the lazy boy method. And it's excessive reliance on previous histories, not confirming claims about source materials, uncritically ignoring works attributed to women philosophers. Instead, the methodology I propose is one that I learned in childhood by reading Agatha Christie. You can see how she changes the name of the book, right? From 10 little niggers to 10 little Indians to Then There Were None. It's the same book. But she's, responding to social pressure, huh? Okay. This female detective methodology I learned growing up reading Nancy Drew mystery stories and Agatha Christie novels. It's a philosophical method. Ask the right questions, question the veracity of the answers that you receive, dig further, and the truth will out. I relied on the historical canon, all those source materials that I've just made fun of. I relied on it to provide clues to the names and works by women that would bring the historical canon closer to being a true canon. I started by searching through indices of histories and philosophies, and a case in point is that Copleston's very famous multi-volume history of philosophy does not list Hypatia in its early editions. But if you turn page after page, you find a half-sentence mention of her. So I paged through things, and this might be what our, tapestry ends up looking like. We don't know. I think I'm going to, in the interest of not being the one who takes up too much time, point out to some of the earlier sources that I use, Gilles Bénage, the pseudo-lexicon. Women have been included in all of these early sources. Lucian, Diogenes Laertius, Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, Plato's Symposium and Menexenus, Aristotle's Metaphysics, Rhetoric, and Poetics all mention women philosophers. Plutarch's Parallel Lives, and there are other works. The Pseudo-Lexicon is the only source for Asar of Lucania's Book of Human Nature. It's the only source. From the 17th century onward, there were only a few. And one of the greatest, Hermann Diels, German, yeah. And whose work includes the fragments of the pre-Socratic women philosophers, and he includes also the Neo-Pythagorean philosophers in there. I'm going to skip through the rest of my argument and show you just a few of the women Catherine Coburn's works, her defense of John Locke. She was one of the first to defend Locke's essay in public, and it cost her greatly. She was London's greatest playwright. She had 4 plays on Drury Lane at the same time when she was in her 20s, right? That's how she supported herself and her mother and her orphan sisters. And in the middle of her plays are bound this gem. And it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's an important and lengthy defense of part of Locke's essay. We're 20th century philosophers looking beyond our noses, for the resources of earlier centuries. They would have found the treasure trove of works by women philosophers. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's probable that some of these more than 1,000 works will turn out to be very important parts of our true canon of philosophy. Unfortunately, too many professional philosophers who wrote the histories of philosophy, taught the subject, I'm going to skip ahead, or served in academic offices, just have ignored the contributions by women. Career advice from Theano of Crotona. It is better to be on a runaway horse than to be a woman who does not philosophize. I think we could all agree. I'm going to close now. Thank you.